Hi, everybody. Happy Saturday. Welcome to FotoFest Creative Conversations Digital. I'm Stephen Evans, Executive Director of FotoFest, and I'm really pleased to be here today and see everybody that's signed on for the program. Well, we've had a lot of fun putting this together, and it's been a great way for us to feel connected to the artists of African Cosmologies and the FotoFest Biennial 2020 and to our audience. So we thank you for participating. And at the end of the program, I'll tell you about some of our upcoming plans. We have talks planned for just about every week through the end of June now. So it's pretty exciting. And if we're not having talks, we've also got new videos that we're rolling out, playlists. We asked Mark Seeley, the curator of African Cosmologies, to put together a playlist. So we're excited to be releasing that to you soon too, as well. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to thank our funders of FotoFest and the FotoFest Biennial 2020, the Houston Endowment, the Brown Foundation, the Texas Commission on the Arts, the National Endowment for the Arts, the City of Houston through the Houston Arts Alliance, the Philip and Edith Leonian Foundation, the Powell Foundation, the WWW Foundation, the Wortham Foundation, David and Martha Moore, Nina and Michael Zilka, the FotoFest Board of Directors, and many generous donors to the FotoFest Annual Fund. We couldn't do this programming without all of their support, and they helped us put together a great show with Mark Seeley, African Cosmologies, and we are really pleased today to have Laura El-Tantawy coming in from Cairo, well, coming in digitally from Cairo. And we are going to, Max Fields, our associate curator, and I are going to have a conversation with Laura and also show one of the aspects of her great projects in the Shadow of the Pyramids that has been on view at FotoFest and will be on view again when we are able to reopen after social distancing ends. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Max Fields and he will introduce Laura.
Hi everyone, my name is Max Fields. I'm the Associate Curator and Director of Publishing at FotoFest, and I want to thank you for joining us for today's creative conversation with artist Laura El-Tantawy. Today we'll begin with the screening of El-Tantawy's film In the Shadow of the Pyramids, and then jump into a conversation with the artist. Following the conversation between me, Stephen Evans, and Laura, we'll open the room up to questions from the audience. Feel free to input your questions on Zoom in the chat box or Q&A at any time. And if you're watching on YouTube Live, leave a comment and we'll relay your questions to the artist. Before watching the film, I'd like to introduce Laura El-Tantawy. Laura El-Tantawy is a British-Egyptian documentary photographer, bookmaker, and mentor. Born in Worcester, she has studied in Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and the United Kingdom. Her work is recognized for its uniquely lyrical eye on reality, exploring the relationship between place and affect, home and belonging. Her work has been awarded, exhibited, and published internationally, including in renowned outlets such as The New Yorker, Afar, Le Monde, National Geographic, Time, The New York Times, Huck, and Foam. She has presented her work in solo exhibitions at venues in Belgium, France, United Arab Emirates, India, the UK, Germany, Spain, Japan, and in the US, and has participated in group exhibitions around the globe, most notably in biennials and festivals such as Breda Photo in the Netherlands, Unseen Amsterdam, Foto Legendo in Rome, and Look 13 in Liverpool. El-Tantawy's self-published monographs have garnered international accolades. In 2015, she released her first title, In the Shadow of the Pyramids, a first-person account that illustrated the fraught connections between subjective memory and personal identity. The publication was shortlisted for the prestigious Duchapour Photography Foundation Prize, awarded annually to an artist of any nationality who has made a significant contribution to photography in Europe. Her other titles include The People, a newsprint celebrating the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, Beyond Here Is Nothing, a meditation on the idea of home, and A Star in the Sea, an illustrated exercise that encouraged embracing the unexpected. In 2011, El-Tantawy earned her MA in Art and Media Practice from the University of Westminster, London, and in 2009, she served as a research fellow at the University of Oxford. Since graduating, she has taught at universities around the globe and presented artist talks at many of the world's most prestigious colleges, museums, and research institutes. She is currently living and working between London and Cairo. We're going to switch screens to view the film, but before we do, Laura, would you like to say a few words about what the audience is going to see?
Yes, hi Max.
Oh, audio, you're muted.
You should hear me now. Sorry. Hi, thanks Max for the lovely intro. And I'd really love to start by thanking you and Stephen for kind of bringing me out of the shadows during this time of involuntary isolation, and for really continuing to pursue ways to still shine the light on this show, which I think was a great initiative that you guys took on and was really beautifully curated by Mark. So thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really looking forward to be here today. And for everybody that's joined us as well, thank you for being here. So we're going to start with a sort of nearly 10-minute video that I created, which basically is a slideshow of the images that are all part of the project In the Shadow of the Pyramids. And you will hear that with a layer of audio that includes my voice, basically narrating the personal narrative that created this work. And basically that kind of takes you on the journey of what this work is about. And you'll also hear sounds from Tahrir Square. So I designed it in a way to give you an experience of what I really want this work to give the viewer. So I hope it translates that way. And that's it. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Standing in the shadow of the pyramids, the beginning meets the end. Here I choose to bury my most valued possession, in a place I once called home. My name is Laura El-Tantawy. I'm Egyptian. I can feel the thump of my heartbeat. Fast, faster. I'm breathing, sweating, suffocating. I'm screaming. I force my eyes open from nightmare to reality. Clock ticking. It's almost 4 a.m. A preoccupied mind disturbing a tired soul. I walk through the hallway to shake off my insomnia. The window, my hope. This is where I've come for a cure since childhood. A panoramic view over downtown Cairo. All the sleepless nights I've spent standing here. This is the window into my soul. In the far distance, I catch sight of my dreams. I returned home 2 years ago to find it's not what it used to be. 730 days and I'm still picking up pieces of myself. There are nearly 90 million people in this country. 90 million stories to be told. This is only one. It was just after sunrise had ushered in a new morning. I stood under Cairo airport's flickering fluorescent lights, my heart pounding ahead of what was about to happen. I knew my life was changing forever. My family surrounded me, my mother weeping, my father worried. This memory has guided my future. I've lived away from Egypt for nearly 2 decades, yet somehow a lot of me remained behind. Being far away yet so close leaves a strong imprint, a sense of love and loss all in one. When people took to the streets on January 25th, 2011, I had to be among them. It was a moment when my past, present, and future came together as never before. In the Square of Liberation, I found dreamers, just like in the films, thousands of them. In Tahrir Square, I found myself again. There's a lot of emotion in Tahrir, but some sadness is starting to creep in. A young man told me he packed a small bag and told his family he was leaving. He told them he was going to the square because he wanted a better future. I told them they may never see me again. I'm here until Mubarak leaves, and I know I may die fighting for it. This is not the story I set out to tell. My time covering Egypt since 2005, I've never seen the country so polarized and sharply divided across such a clear line. Are you with us or against us? How do you tell a story when the plot keeps changing? How do you feel, have empathy, and photograph when you don't understand what's happening anymore? Am I with them or against them? Every picture I take in Egypt has been part of a life document from my own memory. I photograph life. This is what's always inspired me. Now there's a fire raging. So many people have been killed. I've seen their blood seeping away. Now there's a red mound of hate. This country where for a long time I was seeing good over bad has finally pushed me into an intense darkness. Hope, fear, disappointment, joy, pride. This square has seen it all. I ache when they ache, cry when they cry, try to laugh when they try. In their faces I see my own. It's amplified. It's the kind of sadness that floats in the background, chokes you in the throat, hurts you deep in the gut. The first time I saw a dead body was on the morning of July 27th, 2013. A pool of blood and the slippery feeling under my shoes. I remember thinking, this is not where I want to be. I thought facing the dead would make me cry. It didn't. More than 2 years ago, I stood in Liberation Square, one small person among hundreds of thousands of other small people, all fighting, as if we were one, for something really, really big. This feeling of euphoria has now dissipated. This was meant to be a story about searching for familiarity in a country I've long held on to through childhood memories. It's hard realizing home is no longer home. I've lived off my expectations for its potential, piecing together memories from my childhood. My name is El-Tantawy. I'm Egyptian. Standing in the shadow of the pyramids, the beginning meets the end. Here I choose to bury my most valued possession, in a place I once called home.
Okay, everyone.
Thank you.
For the benefit of your viewing experience, if you're watching on Zoom, it might help to switch in the top right corner your view to gallery view rather than speaker view.
Max, your volume is pretty low.
Okay.
A little hard to hear you. So
Let me fix that real quick.
how's everyone hearing me? Is it sounding okay?
Okay, better now?
Much better.
Brilliant. Laura, would you like me to put up the images while we talk?
Yeah, absolutely. We can just have them rolling in the background.
Great. Open with.
Laura, I'm immediately struck by the impressionistic feeling of the film and its power. And I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit about that and this intersection of a subjective memory with a very well-known historical moment.
Yeah, it's a really good question. In many ways, the impressionistic approach that you see is part editing. So being very conscious about the images that I'm selecting to basically speak in this work, and kind of like my own personal growth as a photographer. I've been photographing for, I don't know now, like more than 15 years for sure. And I've had an evolving journey where I started out doing work as a photojournalist. And I've kind of really been trying to explore and experiment more with my vision and see how I can photograph in a way that feels authentic to me and the way that I feel in the situations that I'm photographing. And I think in that journey and in that process, by the time that the revolution happened, you know, I was photographing as early as 2005, before the protests happened. So I was still really finding my own voice as a photographer, but I was kind of exploring my relationship with what I'm seeing through my viewfinder and how I can translate how I'm feeling in a way that seems honest to the moment as I'm feeling it, but also to the situation, I suppose. And I think by the time that the protests came around, I feel like I was quite comfortable with that visual language. And in a way, I feel like I couldn't really photograph the revolution in any other way. Um, the kind of chaos and the movement and the sense of uncertainty that you see in the images and the blurriness of them they're all feelings that felt very true to me when I was in these situations. But also part of it is being very conscious when I was editing to make sure that these were the images that I wanted to keep because they were, they spoke to me and they spoke to what I felt during that great event.
Can you talk about the context behind the cultural and political context behind the 2011 Egyptian revolution? Perhaps it'll help the audience understand like the sort of aesthetic feeling that you wanted to convey, because the history is so loaded.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, historically, in terms of Egypt, we had a Turkish king back in the 50s, and then there was a military coup essentially that removed him. And we were first led by President Gamal Abdel Nasser. There was another Egyptian president that led briefly, then Gamal Abdel Nasser. And we've essentially only had military leadership since. 4 military leaders to be specific: Abdel Nasser, Sadat, Mubarak, and now we have President Sisi. In between, after the revolution, we had President Morsi, who came from the Muslim Brotherhood. That was really the only time for that 1 year that we had somebody that didn't come from the military. But essentially, how we came to the revolution and why it happened was we always had a very autocratic regime. Speaking emotionally as an Egyptian, we grew up in a place where you didn't really have the idea of dreaming. It seemed like everything was really predetermined for you in terms of your fate. So, if whatever college you went to, whatever job you had, these were all things that were set depending on your social class, economics, how much money your family had, what kind of connections you had. So you're functioning in a very controlled setting. So personal aspirations were some things that you knew maybe you couldn't fulfill. So maybe it's not worth dreaming about them. And, in terms of the social structures, we were led by Mubarak for more than 30 years at that point. So Mubarak took over after Sadat was assassinated in 1980 or 81. And essentially he ruled the country for more than 30 years. Starting out really seeming like he had a lot of potential for opening things up and more democratic approach, if you want to say, to politics. And then, gradually he became more autocratic and closed things up. There was a lack of freedom of speech. A lot of people were being put in prison. The torture of Egyptian citizens in prisons and police stations became normalized. So there was a sense of, there's them and there's us. Them being the government and us as being the people. And then essentially the revolution happened. And that was a moment where it was for the first time people came out to speak and fight for a sense of respect and dignity and essentially fight for their own country. Egyptians have always kind of sarcastically said, this is not our country, it's theirs, theirs being just the 5% that rule. So yeah, it certainly is loaded. And obviously this is a very short summary of it. But the events that happened in Tahrir Square really symbolized a moment where Egyptians came together to really fight for something that in a way was long overdue, or, a journey that we had arrived at finally. So hopefully that builds some context.
Yeah. Could you explain the work's title a little bit? In the Shadow of the Pyramids. You say it in the beginning of the video, twice.
And at the end. And you tie them together. Yeah, I'd love to hear more about this.
Yeah, it begins where it ends. So I feel like for me, well, first of all, the way I work, titles always come first to me. So In the Shadow of the Pyramids is a title that was always with the work since I started it in 2005. It was kind of to me, it seemed like sort of poetic title in a way. It's a bit straightforward, but it was quite poetic in the sense that, a shadow, things happen in the darkness of that shadow. So everything that you're seeing is happening in the shadow of these great symbol of this great country. So for me, this is really what kind of the title symbolizes, is what happens in that darkness. And I think in a way it works with kind of my work, because I work my work has a lot to do with, little pockets of light and a lot of darkness. I didn't choose the title that way, but now looking at it in hindsight, it kind of reflects the spirit of the work as well in a way. But yeah, titles always come first for me, and they always help guide me back to the work when I get lost, which happened a lot during this 9-year journey on this work. I always go back to the title and just ask, what am I trying to say? Why did I start this to begin with? And where do I want it to go?
I have a question about your process in terms of the impressionism of the work, and I'm sorry, I have to admit I haven't seen the book, but I imagine that the images from the film are all included in that book. And I was wondering, you talked about the editing. When you're shooting, are you thinking about an emotional resonance? Because something that's quite remarkable is not only capturing the historical moment, but the sort of emotional power that is in so many of your individual images. Or is that something that you pick and choose when you edit? I'm curious about your process of conveying that emotional intensity as it relates to the moment.
Yeah, I think oftentimes it's a bit of both, but I think for me, particularly thinking about the revolution, it was such a loaded event emotionally. I mean, there were so many highs and lows that you couldn't help but feel, because you are part of it. As an Egyptian, I am part of this revolution as well. We're all fighting for something. So yeah, for me, the emotion is very important in the way I photograph, and I only photograph when I feel something or I feel like I have something to say. So there were moments where I didn't take any pictures, and I really wanted to focus on the people, because for me, the protests were never about the signs that people were holding. Essentially, they weren't even about the leaders themselves. They were about the people and what they had to say, and seeing how far people had been pushed to come out. I saw grown men break down and cry. I saw women, like fighting and confronting police officers and men with weapons. And I saw things I never really thought I would see in my own country. And you have to remember that my attachment to Egypt had always been through my childhood. I left Egypt when I was 12 or 13. So I had a very innocent and sort of pure image of the country. So seeing these kind of moments really kind of shook me in a way, and it does change something in you, and it makes you react emotionally. You can't help it. And I did try to capture what I was feeling, the chaos, the confusion, the tears, obviously. But I do have to say that when you are witnessing an event like that, and when you witness moments of such huge euphoria, and seeing this collective voice of people together, I always feel like that there's never any of my images that could have ever captured what that is. You really had to be there to experience it. And I think the photographs, I hope they capture some of the emotion that I experienced. But again, it's so difficult.
What's striking to me is that this image that's on the screen now, the power and intimacy of that image. And I know that both Max and I were curious about that image and had offline had talked about asking you about it. But it juxtaposed in the film and in the physical installation that is in the gallery at FotoFest, of the photo of the crowd from above, and the power of that image. And I'm just struck by the power of those. I think they convey some of what you're talking about, that there's a huge continuum of these different moments that all add up to this powerful movement and this powerful shift at a historical moment.
Yeah, well, thank you for pausing on this image, actually, because it's a really important image, I think, for what this work, even more important now than perhaps even when I took it, what it symbolizes. But because part of the revolution is also the little stories that I think, and the people's lives that have changed. So in this particular case, this woman's name is Safiya, and she was part of a group of women who lost their sons or husbands, who were killed by police during the revolution. There were many instances where there were snipers on rooftops that were targeting protesters, and sometimes on the ground where they were shooting them in the eye. And basically, this woman, Safiya's son, was killed. And I was trying to meet them and kind of get their story and see what they had to say. So this was a day where they went outside the court where Mubarak was on trial, and they had gathered together. And it was the day where they were going to announce whether Mubarak and the former interior minister were going to be held accountable for these deaths. And the court ruled that they weren't going to be held accountable. So obviously, for a woman like Safiya, she felt like her son died and nobody's going to get, punished for it. And hence were the tears. But I think in a way, what I also see in her face, which I didn't even see at the time when I photographed it, was, the mourning, but also the sense of, acceptance in a way. And I think in a way it kind of reflects the spirit of what I see in Egypt in general, even now, that even though there's a sorrow and a sense that we can't really control our fate, you have to accept it and live with it and just kind of make do with what we have. But for me, I'm actually trying to find her again now. So 10 years on, so I photographed her, it's been 10 years since the revolution. I'm trying to find her now and speak to her and see, what she has to say and how those 10 years have impacted her, if she's still alive.
Yeah, I have two questions. One is just hearing the stories of your involvement in this, in the revolution. I'm curious to know how you felt putting yourself in that position of a photographer, as somebody who's, but also as an activist, as a protester as well. And then the second question is leading from this image is what do you think the role of women played in the Egyptian revolution? Because this image, I've read a lot about this image in your previous interviews, and you speak a little bit about that, but I'm just curious to share that with the audience, if you could share that with me.
So I think in terms of like being a photographer and protester, but first being a photographer, in the beginning, I felt really terrified, to be honest with you, because, I arrived to moments of, police on the streets, a lot of confrontations, tear gas, situations that I was never really, I thought I would be in, and I wasn't really even trained to deal with. But I really felt like it was a moment I had to be there. I think there were a lot of moments where I wasn't really sure to be a photographer or a protester. I think as a photographer now, in hindsight, I think it really shaped my photography. It really shaped how I view what I do. It also kind of really formed my vision more in a way. And I'm not talking necessarily just about the protests, because it's a 9-year journey where I was also photographing street life and street scenes. And it also really helped me rediscover my country. I'm somebody that's in a way privileged. I've lived far away. I've lived in the States, and now I live in the UK. I have family in Egypt. So I have a foot both here and somewhere else. Right. So I have the privilege of coming and leaving. And I think this also gives me perspective to be more critical and look at things with more clarity. Mm-hmm. But it also made me feel sometimes, like, am I Egyptian enough to be photographing this? Do I really understand the context? So a lot of my work relied on having conversations with people and bonding with people I didn't know on the streets and asking them questions and, seeing what the general feeling was on a particular day and kind of how that resonates with me and how am I going to photograph that. And sorry, what was the other part of your question, Max?
The role of women in the revolution. You have a lot of like incredible like this image, for example, contrasted with the image of Safiya. It really says a lot. You have one in mourning and, as you said, somewhat like acceptance, and then in this you have someone raising their voice in protest.
Well, I mean, women played a very strong role, like front and center, all the way from, invitations to bring people out on the streets on Facebook and social media through activism, to being out there, with street clinics that were set up to treat people that were wounded, confronting police, doing everything. Women were everywhere. And it's a good question because, I remember at the time when I was there, a lot of the stuff that I was reading in the media said that there weren't enough women, and women were kind of in the back hiding, and it was all about the men, and it's a very male dominant movement. That wasn't really the case. I mean, of course, unfortunately, Egypt has one of the worst I think, or among the worst rates of sexual harassment against women. So a lot of times that really did impact how women acted in the square because they had to protect themselves. So at some points they had to have a cordon where a certain area for women where they could protest. So I mean, but women were there front and center, and they played a key role all the way from beginning to end.
Well, one thing that I noticed in the remarkable image of Safia is that not only is there the mourning and the acceptance, but there also she seems resolute and very strong and calm in the way, and I think that communicates some of what you're talking about in another way that I find fascinating.
Yeah, I think there's kindness actually in her face. There's a lot of kindness in her face, and I think for me, it's I don't know. I think it just shows the beauty of her spirit in a way. I mean, I spoke to her, I photographed her, and then I sat down and I spoke to her and I asked her some questions: why she's there, why she's crying, what happened. So I did have a short interview, and you know, I always try to talk to people because it's really important for me to get the context behind the emotion as much as I
Sure.
can. But there were a lot of situations where I couldn't do that because of the crowds. But her story really stays with me.
You mentioned that you were trying to locate her again, and I'm wondering, do you consider this project completed, or is it continuing, or what have you been doing since you finished the film and the book?
I've been working on other projects. I've had a little bit of a block, actually, like a mental and emotional block to coming back and doing something that is as I suppose, as deep as this work has been. You know, I just haven't been able to do it. I think a lot of it has to do with how the protests and how things evolved during that period and the narrative around it, how it's been manipulated and changed. It's just kind of really made me feel like I can't put my energy into something now because for me it's always important to have understanding and empathy to begin something visually like that, and I just haven't had the understanding to put my emotion into something. But I do feel like that the work lives on in different ways, and whether I bring it into an exhibition or try to create new images or a new version of the book, it's really important for me to continue to give it life in a way that reflects the spirit of how time has changed. So in this 10-year period, things have changed dramatically. So I'm working on kind of creating a new narrative with the same images, because I haven't created new images, with the same images to really reflect on how those images and the time they were taken express something, and how 10 years on now, the narrative has been completely manipulated. So, what value do these images have now? And how can I use them to, reframe the whole story?
Well, I was going to say that the way the installation was done at FotoFest, it really, it's still very much a living, live project and communicating with such power. And as well, I just wanted to remind you that you took 9 or 10 years to make that project. So, you may be in the middle of something that you don't even realize yet.
Yeah.
I know I'm an artist also, and that's sometimes I work in that way. But I'm fascinated that you're remixing it in a sense too.
Yeah, I think for me, I just feel like completely deconstructing the narrative somehow. I still don't really know how to do that. I've been experimenting with tearing the images apart. I don't know, but doing something that really deconstructs it in a way that feels true to how I feel about how this 10-year period has changed the meaning behind these images. So it's so far a work in progress, but I really want to do something to release it and kind of revisit the narrative 10 years on. So January 25th of next year, to have an updated version that reflects that.
And speaking of the narrative, Max and I were having a conversation about the audio in the piece and the way that the narration and the sirens and explosions and maybe gunfire that you hear in the back, how that informs the work too. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when I created it, it was actually the slideshow or the video came after we kind of worked on an installation for the work as a presentation, a projected presentation. So you saw it on screens and you heard audio, and it was a very immersive experience where you walked into a darkened space. And with that space, I really wanted to create something that felt like you were walking into the memory of Tahrir Square. So the echoes on the sounds and sort of my voice, I really wanted to create that. So the video, I kind of created it with a similar philosophy behind it, that I wanted, when you're looking at it, to feel like you're listening to the memory of something, or at least to feel some kind of goosebumps or some eerie feeling behind it. So this is how I kind of worked with the sound layers and bringing my own voice to kind of like tell you, you know, kind of my journey through the work and, how it felt through the stages of it.
I'm curious now, if if this project helped you reckon with the tension between your relationship between your British and Egyptian identity, or like your relationship to your Egyptian identity. Did this project bring any resolve, or do you feel that some of the distance that you felt towards your country um, still exists?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because really that was the main motivation behind doing the work to begin with. I came back at a moment where my family structure had shifted and I wanted to come back and relocate to Egypt. And photography was a really good way for me to discover the streets and rediscover my country and really see how much my identity had changed and how much the country had changed. So it was really about having that conversation. And the revolution, in many ways, in the beginnings of it, I found in Tahrir Square itself um, a lot of resonance with people that were there. We all had very similar stories. We had either left and come back, or some people had never left, but we were all collectively there trying to change something, to create a new place for us where we could all exist and feel proud and feel like we could build something. And I think with seeing how that narrative kind of evolved and seeing also a lot of the blood and the confrontations and a lot of how the media was projecting things and how people were acting on that, there was just like a sense of heightened hostility. And a lot of it was stuff that I couldn't really relate to personally and I couldn't really understand. And that's really essentially why I brought the work to an end. But I think it solved something for me in the end about my identity, that I'm from here, I connect with here, my parents are here, and this is home because my family's here. But I think it also kind of made me feel that home could be anywhere else. And that was actually what led to the work after that, Beyond Years Nothing, was, what is home and the sense of what is belonging. So yeah, I think it did resolve it for me a little bit. But I think for me, the confusing moments were more about being in the square and feeling, should I be protesting or should I be taking pictures, and having to make these decisions, which one is more important?
Right.
We've got an interesting question from Sarah Jane Parsons, and she asked, "Hi, Laura, could you please talk about the use of architecture in your work? It seems like the landscape of Cairo is often a protagonist in your visual storytelling."
Thanks. Hi, Sarah. It's such a beautiful question. The word architecture is not one that I would often associate with my work. But when you speak of the landscape being a protagonist in my visual storytelling, I'm not sure what that means. You guys, can you clarify?
I mean, it does seem like one of the things that I recognize that this image, I pulled up this image on because it to me is the most architectural, because there's a window that offers reflection, and a lot of conversation around architecture and art revolves around ideas around psychoanalysis and that kind of looking out and the relationship between inside and outside. And it seems like there are several images in the series where there's a reflection captured by the photographer. And it's either a reflection of others, of children who, for example, are looking into a car and not seeing themselves. Or for example, in this one, someone looking out, but also being kind of reflected back in. So there is this like interesting thing for me, if I'm thinking about architecture, it in this work, that relationship between public space and private space is really there. We didn't see it much in this slideshow, but one of the things I also picked up on was there are images of you when you were young, and all of those images are in the daytime, and some of them are at home, and they're or like on a bus in these like private spaces, really intimate spaces, and most all of the most actionable, the images of protest, they're all at night, and they're all in these massive public spaces. It seems like there is a conversation there around intimacy in a private space and the sort of riotous but also like enthusiastic you know cry for solidarity in public space, which is
I might
interesting.
can I interject also? I mean, I think Sarah Jane added, yes, a psychology of space. And I think that I don't have control of the slideshow. So this image, which seems shot from a balcony or inside an apartment. This is from the Cosmologies book. That image to me says a lot, because that you were beginning to speak about of your view onto a landscape, and some of the rooftop scenes, these kinds of things.
Well, I think, I mean, now that I kind of understand the depth of the question, wow, because actually reflections is something that I do a lot in my photography. And I think I like it from an aesthetic point of view, and I like the many layers, kind of the complex layers it creates. But I think within the context of Egypt, and this is something I realized in my later work, that a lot of my work is me looking through a window onto something outside. And I think it's an interesting thing for me, because I feel like it's about trying to belong somewhere, or trying to look at something in order to belong to it, or being somewhere where maybe you want to be somewhere else. So I think the idea of it is maybe a little bit to do with belonging or looking for something, and building complex layers as well. I'm not sure. To be honest with you, it's a question that I haven't contemplated much. Because a lot of times I'm working in a very visual way. Like, for example, this image is an image I took from the apartment where I grew up in downtown Cairo. It was during April, where we get huge sandstorms from the desert. This is our laundry hanging in the window. I had a flash on the left side. I took the picture, and I thought it looked really beautiful and intense. And it took like 5 minutes to create it. So certainly, like, the psychology of thinking behind it wasn't there. I think it definitely speaks a lot now, about the sense of suspension and transformation and all of that. But when taking it, it wasn't something that I thought about. I just thought, this is a really interesting moment. I have to capture it. There's a drama behind it.
It's one of my most favorite images of yours, in fact.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So
I don't feel like I've done Sarah's question justice, actually, in answering it, but maybe I can come back to it later if that's okay.
It is a big question,
Yeah.
because but I think it's an interesting one, and I think it'd be interesting. It's an interesting essay that somebody needs to write about your work, about the architecture as a protagonist. I think it's great. I think it's a really interesting idea.
Yeah. Well, I think what I also like about it is, what I like about photography in general is that a lot of times people will see and bring new interpretations and ideas into your work that me as a photographer, I didn't think about. I think in a very visual way and an emotional way that's to me, but a lot of times I'm not seeing these depth of layers, at least when I'm making the image. So yeah.
And we have another question about asking, what do you think is the difference between the images that you make and the images that a traditional photojournalist would make? And the uses of photojournalists' images in media compared to the way in which you distribute and circulate your images.
Well, I think it's a good question. I think for me, when I was photographing all the way from the beginning of 2005 until the end, I was always photographing for myself. You know, I wanted to do something about my Egypt, the Egypt of my grandparents, the Egypt my grandfather talked about, the Egypt that I can see in my childhood images. So I really wanted to kind of photograph that. So I had complete freedom and liberty to do that. I could be creative, I could experiment, I could do whatever I want. I didn't have to tell a particular story. Whereas I think for a photojournalist or anybody photographing the events, there was a particular story that they had to tell. And maybe that maybe kind of limited a little bit how much they could do, or how creative they could get. I didn't have any of these things on me. I could just do whatever I want. Like, this is an image that has nothing to do with the protests. This is actually somebody I photographed just on a swing, a girl I didn't know. But in the context of the protests and everything, it has nothing to do with it. um, so yeah, and I think maybe during those times somebody would only have to photograph in Tahrir Square, whereas I was photographing in other places as well. So I didn't have to restrict myself, and I wasn't really concerned with form in my images. So that impressionistic thing that you see, I think a photojournalist would maybe be a little bit more limited in terms of how far they can take that. I think in some of the images, it's completely unclear what you're seeing and what's happening. So I think that's maybe just a basic distinction.
Yeah. There's an image. Let me see if I can pull it up. It's did I already pass it? Yes. This image, for example, if a photojournalist was documenting the amount of the people in the square, I feel like it would be a very crisp, clear image. But the sense of this image is the movement in this image, the blur, it creates a sort of poetics of a feeling of energy that's really special. Another thing about the use of blur in your images, it makes me think about something Isle Weitzman wrote about blur suggests that the photographer is in danger and has to be quick, has to act fast. And so that always, your work always makes me think that you're always in a precarious position. And or at least it feels that way. It can, especially when in the film, when there's like cracks and pops and bangs and sirens.
Yeah, I mean, certainly what you said really is true to a lot of these images, that in some cases I was kind of like running or trying to hide or pretend, they couldn't see me take a picture. So certainly that feeling that the blurred image is because I had to run is there. But I think, I always went out more at night, and I usually went out by myself. Sometimes I met people and made friends and we kind of moved together, but usually I was by myself. So the sense of fear was very true. I was also having my family telling me, you shouldn't be going out, you shouldn't do this. So I was feeling guilty all the time and I was feeling very fearful. So I think the images really express how I felt in that sense. But I think for me, it was just an aesthetic because I could have photographed at very different settings. But for me, these were the aesthetics that I felt really spoke to how I felt. The other image that you mentioned, this was actually a situation where I went into the rooftop of a building. And this was at like 3 or 4 in the morning in Tahrir Square, looking down where people were kind of mingling. It looked like it could actually be a beautiful summer evening where people were just out and about talking, having ice cream or whatever. But of course, we were in the middle of this protest fighting for our future. And there was the faint sound of a song that I've actually put at the end of the video. It's a song by a singer called Dalida, and it's about coming home to your country where you had your first love. It's a very sentimental and very beautiful song, and people played it in the square a lot of times. So for me, this image really brings all of these emotions back. I was very blurry eyed, I was sleepy, and I just wanted to take an image that really captured that moment. Um, yeah, but people ask me a lot about the aesthetics and the impressionism in the images, and it's so difficult for me to talk about it a lot of times because for me it comes so naturally to photograph this way. Yeah.
In the beginning, you talked about the construction of it, which I think is very telling, that it's definitely an aesthetic and a feeling and an emotional power that you want to convey to the viewer. And we had another question that's very interesting, which is talking specifically about your book, but I also think it relates to the film. And it's how you considered layers and process when you went through designing the book and the film, and how you make them artistic objects.
So for me, what was really important in the book and in the story in general was my own personal narrative, the childhood memories that brought me here to begin with, and how those childhood memories are so different from the Egypt that I'm now seeing on the streets. And how do those two narratives come together? So it was really important for me to find a way to make them speak and be able to sit side by side in a way that shows the sentiment, the innocence, kind of the joy of childhood versus, the chaos, the uncertainty, and the blurriness of what this future is going to be like in this country where I'm from, my home. So in a way, I didn't design the book myself. When I worked on the book, I really tried to find designers that did work or books that I felt spoke to me. So I met with some designers, and the designer I ended up working with, we had an initial meeting and we had a very frank discussion. And he asked me, why do you want to make a book? What do you want your book to say? And I said, I want to make a book that really speaks to my personal narrative where the childhood images are important, but they can sit side by side with what's happening in the country, and they have to be able to live together. And I want it to be a book it's not a happy book, it's not a joyful book, it's a very sentimental book that shows passion but also shows a sense of confusion about the future of this country, but also my future essentially, as well. So this was really the basic foundation of the book. Now the narrative, I do have a copy of the book actually. I don't know if it's very helpful to kind of bring it up, but the narrative
Is it still available? Is it still available? No, sorry.
No,
okay, go ahead.
I made copies, but yeah. So the narrative of how the book came to be is really juxtaposing the childhood with the present, and this is kind of the narrative that you see as you go through the book. And every once in a while you're met by a childhood image that kind of reminds you, like a memory, something that just arrived, and then you continue to go through the book. And the text for me was really, really important. It was the most difficult thing to introduce in the book and the work, because I think the text is what really reveals how I feel and what I have to say. The images, impressionistic as they are, they can be conveyed to mean very different things. But I think put with the layer of text, it really contextualizes what I really want this work to say. So the text is where I felt most vulnerable, I think. But it's also where I felt like I have to be most honest. If I'm really presenting this work in a way that speaks to my whole experience about Egypt, then the text has to be completely honest, and I just have to lay it out there. So that's really, the text is very important.
And is the text in the film, is it related to the text in the book, or is it a different thing? Yeah.
No, the text in the film is exactly the text in the book. Maybe not all of it. I edited down to the film.
And did you feel that same sense of vulnerability when you were making the film and speaking that narrative?
Yeah, absolutely. I think anytime, putting it out there and also putting it out there in your own voice, then you really can't, you can't hide away from it. But I think for me, it's all commitment to tell the story, and it's all really about owning it and owning that this is my story about what I have to say about Egypt and the experience I've had, and what I'm kind of putting out there in a way. So for me, it was really about owning it and owning that this is my story about what I have to say now. And yeah, just sending it out.
We have another question asking how you, they're asking, can you talk a bit about how you employed sound in the film?
So I worked with different sound layers. One was recording my own voice, reading the texts, and the other one was some sounds that I recorded from Tahrir Square myself and the streets in Cairo, some other sounds that I took from YouTube videos that were available on the internet, and basically working with sound layers that I felt worked with the images or worked as a good background or a transition with the images, taking you on that journey that begins, I think, um, a bit open, and it kind of guides you a little bit in a way like the book where you're not really sure where it's going. And then at the very end, it's quite clear that, it's a bit sentimental and it's a bit sad, essentially. So I tried to really work with sound layers that were like that. It was very important for me to include the song that I mentioned earlier
Yeah.
by Dalila. I really wanted to introduce that somewhere, and it felt like a fitting ending. And it was really about working with layers of like echo or different kind of sound. I don't know if you call it distortions, to really make the sound the way that it sounded in my head when I thought about, the memory of Tahrir and what it felt like being there.
I have one, we're at about an hour, so we'll be wrapping up soon, but I have a question that is less related to your work specifically, but related to our current situation as a community. And I'm just wondering what you could tell us about daily life in Cairo right now.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a strange time everywhere, but I think in Egypt it's even more surreal perhaps because, Cairo is the Arab world's most populated city. It's almost 17 million people. The country overall is 100 million people. So, if COVID-19 strikes, massively, it will have huge implications. So it's really quite serious for people to be on lockdown and to stay at home. But it's also a country where there's huge poverty. People have to go to work and they have to survive. So you do see people on the streets going to work. There is a shortage of masks and gloves. A lot of it also has to do with affordability. People can't afford them. The testing, there aren't enough testing kits. So far the official numbers we have are about 5,000 reported cases, or just, around that. They're saying here that our curve is actually going to reach its peak in May. So we're kind of really still riding the storm very slowly right now. So when you go out on the streets, we do have an official curfew from 6 a.m. until about 9 p.m. It's Ramadan now, so until 9 p.m. But during the day, there's activity that seems, strange, given that when you look at the streets of New York or Europe, the streets are empty. There's still a bit of traffic, there's still a bit of a buzz. But there's a sense of, again, uncertainty in the same way it is everywhere. Some people are wearing masks, some people are not. There's confusion. Some people think this whole COVID-19 business is nonsense and they think, this is all made up. There's a conspiracy theory behind it. Some people believe that, we really need to take it seriously. So I think if I had to summarize it, I would say there's confusion more than anything.
Yeah. I think that is true everywhere. It's definitely true here in the United States. Laura, Max, thank you so much. This has been a wonderful hour to spend with you. It's amazing to have this technology and have you here, in front of us from Cairo. And we're just so happy that your work's included in African Cosmologies, Photography Time and the Other. And thank you to Mark Seeley for bringing us together. And we look forward to presenting the work to the public again. And I'm grateful to the audience who were able to attend. I think it was a really, really good day.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate everybody that's tuned in. So thanks a lot.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thanks.
I have some notes about our upcoming program. So you'll excuse me if you see my eyes dart to them from time to time. But again, a thank you to the audience and to the artists. We've adapted quickly, and we're grateful for the enthusiasm that the online audience has had for us, and we're encouraged by that, and we're continuing to create more programs, much more planned. You can follow us by coming onto our mailing list, which you can do through the FotoFest website. www.fotofest.org. You can follow us on Facebook. You can follow us on Instagram. And we have a YouTube page now too, where these conversations live on and you can access them. Next week, we're going to be launching some new programs, including a video response to the work of Sami Balogi by Max Fields. That's a great short film he's put together. We will be presenting this playlist that Mark Seeley has made for us, which is really wonderful. And then after that, we'll be launching into more talks in the following weeks. We really take seriously our role as a platform for art and ideas, and your participation helps make that happen. So again, thank you. The next creative conversation will take place on the evening of Wednesday, May 20th, and I'll conduct a conversation with photographer David Johnson and his collaborator, poet Philip Matthews. And they are two artists that are featured in the 10 by 10 exhibition. And they'll discuss their practices and their collaborative project, Wig Heavier Than a Boot, where Matthews performs for Johnson's camera in their drag persona, Petal. Matthews' poetic responses expand on Johnson's images and explore the relationships between subject and performer, place and memory, and the construction of narrative and identity. After that, we'll return to creative conversations with African's Cosmologies artists, and we'll be talking with artist Faisal Abdul Allah on Wednesday, June 3rd. So you can register for these talks through the FotoFest homepage or on Facebook. And thanks again for tuning in. And thanks again, Laura. It was really fantastic. And I feel like we could talk all afternoon. So I'm sorry to say goodbye, but I really appreciate it. And it's very late there. So, or getting late. So thank you again.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Steve.
Max.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Max, and to the staff of FotoFest too. Bye-bye.
Bye.